The anthropic principle, as you stated, Richard, I think is a complete truism. Of course, we have to be in such and such a kind of planet of the kind that we could appear on. That does not answer the question how we came to exist on it. And I fear I have to disagree with you on Darwinism. Darwinism does not explain life. It may explain certain things about what happens when you've got life. But evolution assumes the existence of a mutating replicator. It does not explain how that replicator came to exist in the first place. Now, that's a major discussion. I want to address the who designed the designer question, because it's the old schoolboy question, who created God? I'm actually very surprised to find it as a central argument in your book, because it assumes that God is created. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that you call the book The God Delusion, because created gods are by definition a delusion. Now, I know, and I ought to explain, that Richard doesn't like people who say to him that they don't believe in the God he doesn't believe in. But I think that this is possibly touching a sore spot, because you leave yourself wide open to the charge. After all, you are arguing that God is a delusion. And in order to weigh your argument, I said that it is you who's arguing that God is a delusion.
Oh, sorry.
And in order to weigh that argument, I need to know what you mean by God. And if you say, if there is a God, you have to ask who created God, that means that you're reduced to thinking about created gods. Well, none of us believe in created gods, Jews, Muslims, or Christians. And I think that argument then is entirely beside the point, and perhaps you ought to put it on your shelf marked celestial teapots where it belongs. The God who created the universe, ladies and gentlemen, was not created. He is eternal. This is the fundamental distinction between God and the universe. It came to exist, he did not. And this is precisely the point the Christian apostle John makes at the beginning of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word. The Word already was. All things came to be by him. God is uncreated. The universe was created by him. Now, I don't know whether Richard has difficulty with the concept of the uncreated. I don't know, and I'd love to know whether he believes as a materialist that matter and energy and the laws of nature were always there, because if they were, he does believe in something eternal. So perhaps the difficulty lies in believing in an eternal person. But I want to probe deeper into this, because he suggested that introducing God would mean an end of science. God is no explanation, since by definition God is more complex than the thing you are explaining. Now, this, he states, is the central argument of his book. I would not have expected an argument like this from a scientist, because explanations in science themselves are usually in terms of increasing complexity. An apple falling is a simple event. The explanation in terms of Newton's law of gravitation is already stretching the minds of many people, but its explanation in terms of a warp in space-time is stretching the minds of the cleverest. Simplicity isn't the only criterion of truth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're an archaeologist, and I'm exploring a cave with you, and you're a Chinese expert, and on this cave you see two scratches. And you say, human intelligence, and I say, pardon, they're just two scratches. And you say, but those are the Chinese character run, which means a human being. But I say, look, Richard, that's no explanation at all. You're postulating something as complex as a human brain to explain two scratches. That means that your explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. That's no explanation at all. Now, it seems to me that's exactly what you're saying in your book. The reason we can deduce something as sophisticated as human intelligence from two scratches on a cave wall is because they have a semiotic dimension. They carry meaning. And that fascinates me as a mathematician, because the reductionist is committed to deducing things that carry meaning, and I would include the DNA molecule among them, is committed to explaining those in terms of the basic materials. But as was pointed out a long time ago by a Nobel Prize winner, Roger Sperry, the meaning of the message is not going to be found in the physics and chemistry off the paper and ink. And it fascinated me too to see that you approved in your book of the physicists looking for a TOE, a theory of everything. But that's a theory where the buck stops. Incidentally, there is no hope for a TOE, as Stephen Hawking has said in 2004 on the basis of Gödel's mathematics and its application to physicists. So I'm interested that you were prepared, as I understand it, to agree that a TOE was a good thing in physics. It's perhaps you like a TOE, a toe, provided there's no God attached to it.
I'm going to reply to what John Lennox said about the proof thing. Who created God? I mean, the word created was smuggled in by somebody else. I didn't, or maybe I did say who created God. That's not the point. The point is not whether God is a created thing or not. The point is this issue of simplicity, which you rightly went on to talk about. In order to understand the existence of complexity, we can't just postulate complexity. We have to go back to simplicity. Now, John used the illustration of an archaeologist, wasn't it, who found some scratches on a cave. And it was supposed to be a powerful argument that said, well, these scratches are very simple, but the person who did the scratching was complex. That's nothing to do with the argument I'm putting. The argument I'm putting is that if we're trying to explain complexity, we need some kind of an ultimate explanation for the existence of a complex object, an improbable object. Certainly, the scratches on the cave are simple, and certainly the human that made those scratches is complex. If you went to another planet and you found some scratches which indicated the existence of life, we would both postulate the existence of a complex living being, but we would both need an explanation for where that complex living being came from. And I put it to you that just to say it was always there, or it just happened, is precisely the kind of non-explanation which creationists accuse evolutionists of erecting. They say, how could an eye come about by sheer chance? Well, of course an eye couldn't come about by sheer chance. It has to come about by a gradual, incremental process from simple beginnings. Exactly the same is true of anything complex. And a God, you can't just duck the issue, you can't just evade the issue by saying God was always there. You still need an explanation. So it tells you nothing to say that the scratches on the wall are simple. And by the way, the idea that physics is complex because it's difficult, that's a confusion of the two words, of the two meanings of the word simple. Simple meaning easy to understand, and certainly modern physics isn't too easy to understand, but there is a sense in which it's simple in the way that biology isn't. Now, I haven't got much time to deal with
a couple of extra minutes.
Well, no, sorry, I didn't mean to steal that. Let me come on to the thing about Christianity being dangerous. The reading from the preface, with the quote from John Lennon, "Imagine no Taliban," and all that, that I think is self-explanatory, and I won't go into that. I think what I will do is zero in on the particular point of the third quotation, I think it was, which was about children and the evils of teaching children that certain things are true without evidence, teaching them that faith is a virtue. I would not for a moment say that all religion is bad, all religion is dangerous, or Christianity is dangerous. Certainly, only a minority of religious people are bad or do bad things. The point about teaching children that faith is a virtue is that you're teaching them that you don't have to justify what you do. You can simply shelter behind the statement, "That's my faith," and you're not to question that. What I'm objecting to is the convention that we have all of us bought into, whether we are religious or not, that religious faith is something to be respected, something not to be questioned, and if somebody says, "That's my faith," then you simply have to respect it, tiptoe gently away and say nothing more. In most cases that's quite harmless, but if you are the kind of person who takes your faith really literally and who believes that Allah has ordered you or it would be the will of Allah that you go and blow somebody up, then it is the fact that you were educated as a child in a madrasa to believe implicitly in the faith that you were taught and not to question it, which, if you happen to be of an unstable turn of mind, or if you happen to be of a violent turn of mind, leads to the sorts of terrible acts which are done in the name of religion. I must stress again, I'm not saying that the majority of religious people do terrible acts. I am saying that faith is a terrible weapon because it justifies the performance of terrible acts, which do not have to be justified by reason or evidence. The one gift I would wish to give to any child is skepticism. Don't believe something just because you're told it. Don't believe something because it's your tradition. Don't believe something because it's in a holy book. Look for the evidence and question skeptically. And if everybody did that, we wouldn't be suffering some of the terrible things that are going on in the world at the moment.
Dr. Lennox?
I'd dearly love to come back on the first one, Richard. I think there's a slight obsession with the simple to complex. If you're building a factory, say for manufacturing computers, they'll dig a hole in the ground first. That's very simple, and it gets more complex as it goes up. But everything comes from the mind of the planners. And what I'm talking about is inference to the best explanation. And the inference, when we look at the semiotics, say, of DNA and the fact that it carries a biological message, so to speak, to an intelligent designer, seems to me to be much more sensible than the inference to mindless processes that we do not know can do any such thing. But that's a big debate, and we've both written about it, and you'll have to be referred to the literature, because I want to come to this topic about Christianity being dangerous, and I want to agree very largely with a lot of what you say, the danger of fanatical religion that fans the flames of violence. And quite frankly, I'm ashamed as a Christian of the reputation, particularly in the Middle Ages, the Crusades and so on, that they're associated with Christianity. But I'd like to point out that the perpetrators of that kind of atrocity were not following Christ, but they were actually disobeying his explicit command, because he prohibited, very famously, as you know, his followers from using physical weapons. My kingdom is not of this world, he told them. He told Pilate. And it's very interesting, to my mind, that Christ was actually put on trial for being a fanatical terrorist. That's very easy to forget, and he was publicly exonerated from the charge by the Roman procurator. Truth cannot be imposed by violence, particularly the truth that Christ had come into the world to bring a message of God's love and forgiveness. So I would agree with you, and the danger of training children to be fanatics by not allowing them to question is a very serious one. And I'm so glad that I had parents who encouraged me to think, and part and parcel of the Christian faith was that thinking. Now, you ask us to imagine with John Lennon a world without religion. Well, I'd like you to imagine with John Lennox a world without atheism, with no Stalin, with no Mao, with no Pol Pot, to name the heads of the 3 officially atheistic states. A world with no gulag, no cultural revolution, no killing fields. I think that would be a world worth imagining too. And I must say, I am very disturbed in your book by what seems to me to be an attempt to airbrush out the atrocities of the communist world. I've spent a lot of time visiting that part of the world, and I don't recognize anything that you say. Atheism was not peripheral to Marxism. For Marx, the criticism of religion was the foundation of all criticism. And so, it concerns me that a scientist who's very interested in historical science in the sense of evolutionary biology unraveling history is content with a very superficial analysis of the period of the Cold War. and even more disturbed to read things like this. Even if we accept that Hitler and Stalin shared atheism, they both also had moustaches, as do Saddam Hussein. So what? Well, yes, all three of them had noses in common with the rest of us. But what kind of reasoning is this? We're not talking about shared characteristics in general, but the motivating ideology that drove these men to murder millions in their attempt to get rid of religion, whether Jewish, Christian, or anything else. So I'm very disturbed at your historical analysis. You write that you don't believe there's an atheist in the world who would bulldoze Mecca or Chartres or York Minster or the Cathedral of Notre Dame. But what about the thousands of churches that were demolished in Stalin's Russia and the forced transformation of them into museums? Now, I can understand why one would want to rewrite the history of the 20th century to airbrush out the role of atheism, because one could very easily draw a parallel between the anti-religious agenda of the new atheists and the attempt of communism to obliterate religion. That's not going the right way, I think. And I'm sure that you would be rightly insulted, and I wouldn't suggest it for a moment, if I were to say that because you and Stalin were atheists, that you would have approved of the ruthless elimination of millions. You rightly expect me to differentiate between atheists. I would like you to write another book in which you differentiate between religions, because they are not all the same. Some support fanaticism, others don't. And then finally, you contend that the teachings of moderate religion are an open invitation to extremism. Well, that is not true of the teachings of Christ. I can't speak for other religions. But what about the moderate teaching of atheism? I've sat beside a young girl of 13 in the GDR who's just been told as the brightest child in the school that she cannot have any more education since she's not prepared to swear public allegiance to the atheistic state. I would call that intellectual murder, and it was committed many times in the name of atheism. But according to you, it's far worse than bulldozing buildings, but you say there's not the smallest evidence that atheists do such things. But there is. But perhaps I've misunderstood you.
You did.